We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe, give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website bookedonrock.com. Steven Hyden is our guest to talk about his new book, Long Road, Pearl Jam, and the soundtrack of a generation. Ever since Pearl Jam first blasted onto the Seattle grunge scene 3 decades ago with their debut album 10, they've sold 85 million plus albums, performed for hundreds of thousands of fans around the world, and have even been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In Long Road, Pearl Jam and the soundtrack of a generation, music critic and journalist Steven Hyden celebrates the life, career, and music of this legendary group, widely considered to be one of the greatest American rock bands of all time. Long Road is structured like a mixtape, using 18 different Pearl Jam classics as starting points for telling a mix of personal and universal stories. Each chapter tells the tale of this great band, how they got to where they are, what drove them to greatness, and why it matters now. Much like the generation it emerged from, Pearl Jam is a mass of contradictions. They were an enormously successful mainstream rock band who felt deeply uncomfortable with the pursuit of capitalistic spoils. They were progressive activists who spoke in favor of abortion rights and against the Ticketmaster monopoly, and yet they epitomized the sound of traditional, male-dominated rock and roll. They were looked at as spokesmen for their generation, even though they ultimately projected profound confusion and alienation. They triumphed and failed in equal doses, the quintessential Gen X tale. Impressive as their stats, accolades, and longevity may be, Hyden also argues that Pearl Jam's most definitive accomplishment lies in the impact their music had on Generation X as a whole. Pearl Jam's music helped an entire generation of listeners connect with the glory of bygone rock mythology, and made it relevant during a period in which tremendous American economic prosperity belied a darkness at the heart of American youth. More than just a chronicle of the band's career, this book is also a story about Gen X itself, who, like Pearl Jam, came from angsty, outspoken roots and then evolved into an establishment institution without ever fully shaking off their uncertain outsider past. For so many Gen Xers growing up at the time, Pearl Jam's music was a beacon that offered both solace and guidance. They taught an entire generation how to grow up without losing the purest and most essential parts of themselves. Written with a celebrated blend of personal memoir, criticism, and journalism, Hyden explores Pearl Jam's path from 10 to now. It's a chance for new fans and old fans alike to geek out over Pearl Jam minutia, the B-sides, the beloved deep cuts, the concert bootlegs, and explore the multitude of reasons why Pearl Jam's music resonated with so many people. As Hyden explains, most songs pass through our lives and are swiftly forgotten, but Pearl Jam is forever. Steven Hyden is the author of This Isn't Happening, Twilight of the Gods, Your Favorite Band is Killing Me, and Hard to Handle with Steve Gorman. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, Billboard, Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, Grantland, the AV Club, Slate, and Salon. To hear this episode's playlist, head over to the show notes page. Steven, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Pearl Jam, one of the few bands, along with the Stones and U2, who are still together, and you address this topic in the preface of the book, and there's an interesting comment that you make about Pearl Jam's longevity, and you write, quote, "Imagine Bono evolving into Jerry Garcia. You can't. It defies logic. And yet that approximates a rough sketch of Pearl Jam's development in their first decade." Can you talk about that? That's interesting.
Yeah, with Pearl Jam, the first record, 10, comes out in 1991, and it becomes one of the biggest debuts by a rock band ever. By 92, Pearl Jam really became a phenomenon. And, it's interesting with that band because I feel like people forget just how big they were over the first 3 records. I mean, they were doing Taylor Swift numbers in terms of sales. I mean, they were a band that could sell like 1 million records in 1 week, which now just seems inconceivable that a rock band could do that. But Pearl Jam was like among like the last bands of that sort of like commercial power. So like when I wrote that in the intro, I was really trying to convey how Pearl Jam came from this place relatively quickly in their career where they did have the sort of prominence that a band like U2 had, very mainstream, very sort of being at the forefront of like what we would call arena rock, really. And then they ended up in a place where they were still really popular, but it was more of a cult band type status, more of like a Grateful Dead type model, where, like the Dead, Pearl Jam can play stadiums now, but they have virtually like no mainstream media profile at all. Like you don't see them on award shows, you don't see them, popping up on the Today Show to promote their record or something like that. It is, as much as it can be for a band of that size, kind of an underground thing, So that was one of the things I decided was really interesting about their career arc, talking about that, because there's really not another band that I can liken them to in that regard.
I certainly do remember Pearl Jam being huge. I was in college when that 10 album came out, and the video's on MTV, and it's on the TV in the dorm main room there, and you walk down the hall and you're heading to class and what's that, And then the next thing you know, guys on the floor, you got to hear this, man. You got to hear this. Pearl Jam. These guys are awesome. And then, like you said, literally 1 million copies in 1 week. That was Versus, right? That was the second album.
Yeah.
It's insane. It's insane how big they were. Yeah.
Because, 10 was more of like it wasn't an overnight success. I mean, it was a relatively slow build. I mean, it comes out in August of 91, and it really wasn't until like the following summer that it became this phenomenon. And it was coupled with the single soundtrack, which featured a couple of Pearl Jam songs. There was the Temple of the Dog record. Hunger Strike from that record was a big MTV hit. And then you had the Lollapalooza tour in 92 that Pearl Jam was on. And, they were not the headliners of that tour, but proved to be really like the breakout stars, along with Soundgarden and the Chili Peppers also from that period.
Yeah, because Alive was the first single.
Yeah.
And I don't think it wasn't until Jeremy the video blows up. So I don't know. I'm trying to recall the
Jeremy was like the big one. I remember Even Flow being...
Is that the second single?
That was the second one. I remember that one because Pearl Jam was on tour in Europe for the first part of 92. And that was when the momentum really started to build. They did their MTV Unplugged in May of 92. And that ended up being like a big sort of ubiquitous thing. So, I mean, it was like this perfect storm that really kind of came together. And then you get to Versus, and it's like all of that momentum just like exploded. The thing that had taken about like 2 years to build, it's like, okay, now, and that's true oftentimes, like where the record after the really big record is the one that benefits, like at least like in the first week, because people are so excited about the first record. And now it's like, okay, now we're going to have like the 1 million people buy the record in the first week with Versus.
There is a strong connection to The Who with Pearl Jam. They seem to have influenced Pearl Jam maybe more than any other band. Where do you hear those influences most in those early Pearl Jam albums?
Well, I think on Eddie Vedder specifically, because he's a well-known fan of The Who, and Pete Townsend, surely as a songwriter. I mean, obviously, we talk about Footsteps with Alive and Once, and that has been described by Eddie Vedder as being sort of like a mini opera, talking about like this sort of like psychopathic killer and how he ends up on death row and all that stuff. So, I mean, that's kind of like a more obvious way of, linking Pearl Jam to The Who. But like in my book, I just write about how, The Who, they were this band that, they played stadiums. They're this sort of quintessential arena rock band, but it was also expressing a very specific point of view. It was Pete Townsend's point of view, almost like a singer-songwriter type dynamic, as opposed to like a band like Led Zeppelin, for instance, where you listen to Led Zeppelin and it's not like you really feel like Robert Plant or Jimmy Page is expressing something like personal necessarily, like it's a different kind of dynamic. Whereas with Pearl Jam, it's this big rock thing, but it also has this sort of introspective thing baked into it as well. So that, I think, is one way that I think those two bands are similar. Also, that they're both great live bands who I think struggle to make great studio records. You know, I love a lot of Who albums. I love a lot of Pearl Jam albums, but I think in the case of both bands, I'd rather listen to bootlegs than their recorded material.
You know what's interesting too is the influences that come from the other guys in the band. I think it's Stone Gossard who's a big fan of UFO and Van Halen and some of it. So
yeah, McCready too. You know,
McCready too. Yeah,
I think McCready definitely has that. I mean, McCready loves Kiss. You know, he's talked about that. You know, he. I mean, if you look at early Pearl Jam clips, I mean, Mike McCready looks like Stevie Ray Vaughan. I mean, he's wearing like a lot of scarves and
that's the other one,
wide brimmed hats and stuff like that, or like even like Richie Sambora or something. You know, like he kind of has that like rock thing. I mean, McCready in various solos has like teased Hendrix licks. Like if you listen to early versions of Porch, you know, he's teasing like a Voodoo Child like in that song. So things like that, and you know, and he's played like the Hendrix Star Spangled Banner in Yellow Ledbetter, and also teased Little Wing in that song too. So you know, there's definitely a lot of Hendrix in what he does.
Well, Mother Love Bone was interesting because there's that combination. It was like a combination of that late 80s metal with what was to come with bands like Pearl Jam, obviously, but Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. It was a mix.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's a famous story about this band Green River, which was a band that was a precursor band to Mother Love Bone, a band that Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament were in, along with members of Mudhoney, before that band broke up and they splintered in two different directions. But there's a story about Green River opening up for Jane's Addiction in the late 80s in Los Angeles, and you know, Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard were just totally transfixed by Jane's Addiction, and Mark Arm, who was in Green River and later went on to form Mudhoney, he thought Jane's Addiction like were ridiculous. And that really kind of shows like how those two bands that would diverge, you know, like where Mudhoney is more of this sort of like garage rock punk band, whereas Pearl Jam plugged into what Jane's Addiction was doing, which was taking, you know, like Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith and all that 70s rock stuff and infusing it with, like, for lack of a better term, an alternative rock type sensibility. And I think Mother Love Bone was definitely plugging into that in a more, I think, derivative way. Like, you listen to that record and it does feel like a band that's trying to do Jane's Addiction and not as well as Jane's Addiction. Whereas with Pearl Jam, I think they could do that grandiose rock thing, but because Eddie Vedder was such a different type of frontman from Perry Farrell, it just was going to be its own flavor. You know, like Andrew Wood, who I think he was a great frontman too, but he was more in that sort of Perry Farrell lane of like sort of like self-aware, semi-ridiculous, like rock god type posturing, where it's like kind of funny but like also totally serious at the same time. Whereas Eddie Vedder didn't have, obviously he was not that kind of frontman who was going to put on sparkly clothes and prance around like a new version of Freddie Mercury. I mean, that wasn't Eddie Vedder at all. He was something different, you know, and it's just one of those things of timing. You know, like Pearl Jam's timing, I think, was so perfect in the early 90s. Like if they had come along 5 years later, I don't think they would have been nearly as successful. You know, they would have had to have a DJ in their band. They would have had to have, like, Eddie Vedder would have had to be like rapping in his songs. Ooh. You know, because that's like when new metal was really starting to come into play. And if they had come along 5 years earlier, I don't think it would have hit either, because that was, you know, the prime of like Def Leppard and Motley Crue. You know, Pearl Jam would have been more of like a niche type band probably in that era.
Yeah.
Because of when they came, people were just ready for a band like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, they talk about timing is a big part of it. A big part of it. Yeah. And you mentioned Zeppelin a few times, and I was saying I remember how huge Pearl Jam was, but I never thought about the parallels with Zeppelin, which you talk about in the book. In 1995, they were actually more popular than Led Zeppelin was in 1972. 10 still ranks among the best-selling albums of the era. No rock band had ever sold nearly 1 million copies of an album in 1 week. Pearl Jam did it with Versus, as you said. That was 1993. The following year, Vitalogy sold almost 900,000 units in its opening week. But something happens in 1995. You write that fate had seemingly turned against them. Jan Wenner slams the band in a Rolling Stone article in 1996. Why all the hate towards Pearl Jam in the mid-90s, and how does that affect the band from that point forward, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's like a lot of factors that go into. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of hate towards Pearl Jam. I wouldn't put it that way.
Yeah.
I would say that number one, there was a lot of stripe inside the band, and again, this is all like pretty well known stuff. I think. I mean, the Ticketmaster thing was obviously a huge factor in the band that was hurting them at the time. Ultimately, even though I think, especially now, we look back on it and Pearl Jam looks, more righteous than ever for taking that stand. I mean, now we're dealing with, the Justice Department now is talking about looking into Live Nation, because of the whole Taylor Swift Ticketmaster meltdown that's been going on in the past week. And I think it's a given now almost that like Ticketmaster is a monopoly, but they were a monopoly back then too. And Pearl Jam was the only band that was willing to put themselves on the line to speak out against Ticketmaster, going to the steps of actually trying to tour without using Ticketmaster at all, doing their own ticket system, using non-Ticketmaster affiliated venues, and really proving that you can't tour without Ticketmaster in 1995, because the tour was like just fraught with problems. I mean, they were playing all these backwater venues. Fans were getting ripped off because it was so easy to, forge tickets. And the cause against Ticketmaster, I again, like if you take like the long view of it, it was a righteous cause, but in the short term, it just annoyed a lot of people because it made it more difficult to see Pearl Jam at the peak of their popularity. And that was like a driver of like a lot of tension in the band. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there was hatred towards them.
No.
I mean, there was always going to be, they were so popular that there were going to be people that resisted that band and would maybe be annoyed by their popularity. I mean, and that's another thing too. You couple that with like Eddie Vedder's own ambivalence about being so popular. That was another driver of tension in the band.
You're right. Yeah, it's not hate. It's more of like, I remember the eye rolls. Like, all right, and because they were everywhere and they had been overexposed and not something they wanted. They didn't want to be overexposed, but it was what it was. And
the thing is too is that Pearl Jam in essence spawned their own genre of like Pearl Jam sound-alike bands. So you get to the point where it's not even your own records being played a lot. It's other records that are similar to yours. And it creates a template for rock radio that by the end of the 90s, I think a lot of people just despised. Post-grunge sound, and we all know what bands I'm talking about, like the Nickelbacks and the Creeds and the Days of the New and all those kind of bands. And especially like the vocal style of Eddie Vedder, became a cliche on rock radio. And that negatively affected Pearl Jam through no fault of their own, just because they were so popular. But, even if you loved Pearl Jam at the time, it was like enough of that. It became overbearing, I think, even for people who probably loved the band at that time.
Yeah, which I was going to go there with the next question. Scott Weiland, Stone Temple Pilots, and you say the story of Scott and STP fascinates you. In the context of Pearl Jam, you say STP is like the bizarro world version of Pearl Jam.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't think they sounded all that much like Pearl Jam, especially, and I agree, after the band's first album, Core. They had more of a melodic pop sensibility. And Scott was more like David Bowie than Eddie Vedder.
Yeah, and it's really only the song Plush that I think, that you could say is similar to Pearl Jam. And the video for that song just fed into that because... And it's interesting, I write about this in the book, that Pearl Jam and Stone Temple Pilots, they had two essential shared collaborators. One was Brendan O'Brien, the record producer, who started producing Pearl Jam records with Versus and worked with them throughout the 90s and beyond. And Brendan O'Brien also produced Stone Temple Pilots. All of their most famous records in the 90s were produced by Brendan O'Brien. So you have that shared collaborator, and then you have this video director, Josh Taft, who directed the first two Pearl Jam videos, Alive and Even Flow, and also directed the first two Stone Temple Pilots videos for Sex Type Thing and Plush. And for Plush, the way he shoots Scott Weiland, it's as if he's trying to make him look like, as much as he can, like Eddie Vedder, particularly like the cheekbones. He shoots him from above, and the way he's lit and the facial expressions that he makes, it's very Eddie Vedder-esque, you know. And it's funny to me that no one thought to comment on that while they were making the video. Maybe the idea was that it was a good thing because Pearl Jam was so popular, but it really did saddle Stone Temple Pilots with a reputation I don't think that they deserve. Because like by the time you get to like their second record, Purple, I don't think that record really sounds anything like Pearl Jam. I mean, as you were saying, you know, Scott Weiland, he could sing in that lower register that, you know, was reminiscent of Eddie Vedder, but he could also do a lot of different other things with his voice, where it is, he could do like a David Bowie type thing. He could do like a John Lennon kind of Beatlesque type thing. He is, I think, a more versatile vocalist than Eddie Vedder. You know, like Eddie Vedder's a great singer, but like Eddie Vedder just sounds like Eddie Vedder. You know, like Scott Weiland can do like a lot of different things, which in a way maybe makes him less distinct as a vocalist. You know, like he doesn't have necessarily the signature style that Eddie Vedder has. But yeah, it's unfortunate. You know, the reputation they got saddled with, and you know, Pearl Jam didn't really help them out in that regard either. You know, there's a famous Rolling Stone interview that Cameron Crowe did with the band in 1993, and the video for Plush comes up, and Eddie Vedder basically says, like, you know, this band is from San Diego. Like I used to live in San Diego. I don't know who this band is at all. Really implying that they're this like sort of carpetbagger rip-off band. And again, it's unfortunate because I do think that set up a narrative that hurt that band in a way that I think was unfair ultimately, because they have a lot of good records. I like,
oh yeah,
like I feel like people just dismiss STP out of hand because maybe they remember a few songs. They remember Sex Type Thing or something. But I don't know, Purple and Tiny Music and Number 4, there's tons of great songs on those records.
It's not only commercially successful, but yeah, just solid music. Even Sour Girl, right up to the early 2000s.
The DeLeo brothers, I think, were just really good tunesmiths. I mean, they wrote really kind of, you know, catchy music. And, you know, I think Pearl Jam is a much better live band than STP is. But STP, it's funny because they both use the same producer, but I think STP was a little better suited to making records. You know, sometimes you can be such a great live band that you end up trying to replicate what you do on stage in the studio, which usually doesn't work. You know, your record, because making records it's a different thing. It's more of it's like making a film rather than doing a play. You know, you have to piece things together. And I think
there's the Grateful Dead comparison, right? I mean, the Dead had that was their challenge to try to take that live sound and bring it into the studio, and it's not the same thing.
I think that's true of the Who, and even someone like Bruce Springsteen, who's obviously made a lot of great records. But again, he's someone where, you know, me being a big Springsteen fan, like I would probably rather listen to his live bootlegs than his records. You know, like if there's something that band, what he does with the E Street Band live, it just, you know, as good as those albums are, it can't compare to the live thing. But yeah, STP, I think they could embrace the studio and doing and the different things that you can do in a studio to, you know, create like really kind of powerful records. You know, by the time they're getting to like Tiny Music and stuff, there was more of like a Beatlesque thing to what they were doing. I think that was pretty interesting.
Looking back on that era, sadly, Scott Weiland no longer with us, and so many of Eddie's peers, Kurt Cobain, Weiland, Chris Cornell, Lane Staley, all gone. What do you credit Eddie Vedder's ability to survive that period, considering the pressures of fame, the money, the temptations that he was surrounded by, I'm sure?
Well, number one, he never got involved in drugs, from what we can tell, like, which is obviously a good thing. Sadly, those other people that you mentioned, there's, the one of the shared links is like substance abuse, and that's sadly a very common story in music. And Pearl Jam, for the most part, has avoided that. Like Mike McCready has had some issues with that over the years, but for a band of their success and prominence, they've been relatively lucky in that regard. I also think that with Pearl Jam, they did things in their career that in the short term hurt them, and again, we go back to the Ticketmaster example, but there's like lots of, like not making music videos, or not doing certain things that in the short run would have helped their career probably, but in the long term, those are the things that have probably allowed them to continue. Like the power of no, I think, is a really sort of underrated thing for bands having long-term careers, because especially Pearl Jam early on, if you look at the 10 album cycle, there's tons of interviews with those guys, because they were a young band and they were trying to promote themselves and they were going for it. And then by the time you get to Versus and Vitology, the number of interviews go way down, and that was an interesting thing writing this book, because there's actually not a ton of press about them after the 10 period, but because they were willing to not do anything to be successful, not or to kind of pull back at certain times when their own mental and physical well-being needed to be tended to. I think that those are the decisions that allow you to continue, whereas the bands that maybe aren't as good at communicating, or they can't take their foot off the gas, I think that's where burnout happens. Like I was just thinking about that Beatles documentary that came out last year, Get Back, and it's amazing to me, that movie, because it takes place in January of 1969. They had only just put out the White Album at the end of November of 1968. So it's about 6 weeks or so later, and they're already in the studio working on another record. And it's like, you just put out a double record and you're the Beatles, like you don't need to already be making a record. You like, whenever I watch that movie, I just feel like I wish someone could have just said to them, take a year off, make a solo record or go on vacation, and then we'll make another record. If they had done that, maybe they wouldn't have broken up, but it's like there was that period of time where they just constantly worked. That band never stopped until they broke up, and that's why their output is so incredible, that they could just put out sometimes multiple albums in a year, and they'd be and also singles that weren't on the albums, that were like both songs were great, like Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane were like on the same single, like Hey Jude and Revolution were on the same single. Like the B-side is a classic. It's not really even a B-side, it's a double A-side, and they did that over and over and over again, which is great. But it's also like, oh, why wasn't someone just saying like, hey guys, look, you don't have to work this hard, take a break, reboot, and then we'll come back, and we're still going to be the Beatles. It's not like people are going to forget about us if we don't put out a record, but that was the fear.
Without a manager at that point, right?
Yeah.
So Paul's trying to take on that role, and that's not working. And
I mean, maybe they would have broken up anyway, but I do think that schedule was so punishing for them that it just made them hate each other too. Like they never got the space to just be themselves, to be out of the Beatles bubble, and then go back and be able to like appreciate it with like a fresh perspective. It was just drudgery probably by the end. That's where a band like Pearl Jam can benefit from the experience of other bands, because I do think a band like that, all those guys are such big music fans, they must, I know that they study other bands, and I think that's something that, like, when you look at modern bands that are still around, that does seem to be like a lesson that they've all learned. Like Radiohead is the same thing, like like Pearl Jam, they've become a lot less active in their later years. They've only put out 2 albums in like the last 10 years, 11 years, and they've done all these side projects and stuff, but but they've never broken up, like and they might announce a tour next week for all we know, or like a band like Fish, same thing. It's like they're not going to tour all year long. They're going to tour in the summertime, and they're going to make a ton of money, and they're also not going to kill themselves, on the road. So yeah, it seems like the legacy bands of today have maybe learned a lesson from that. Like, you have the power of no. You don't always have to just do anything to keep your career going. Like, if you've been around for a while, you have some security. You can chill out a little bit, take it a little easier on yourself.
Yeah, the Beatles didn't have a course that they could take. They were brand new to it. Now all these bands, this really is their course to take. Like, watch these bands, read their bios, find out what happened. If you want to end up like them, you're going to have some issues here if you keep living like this, or you keep working so hard. But an example is Dave Abruzzese. The band is so grounded, it seems, but that was the issue with Dave, right? That's Pearl Jam's 3rd drummer, and he's in the band from 91 to 94. He seems to be like he's living up that rock and roll lifestyle, and if he's got money to spend, he's going to spend it. And the guys weren't cool with that, right? Like he would buy not just one toy, 2. I got 2 guns, right? That's the song Glorified G. Why was he ultimately fired, and why is he so divisive among the fans, as you write in the book?
Well, there was definitely an issue with him and Eddie Vedder, and it's, the official story is what you were just saying, that there was this pursuing like maybe more of like a traditional rock star path. I don't know how much I'd buy that, really. To me, it seems like more of just like a personal sort of animus there. It seems like he just like annoyed Eddie Vedder, like on some level. I mean, if you look at him, he is more of like, not even like a rock star, but like a rock dude. Like, he looks like a guy that could have been like in an 80s metal band. And, maybe that just wasn't going to be compatible with what they were doing going forward. I mean, I have like a lot of affection for him, because I think he is sort of like this goofy guy who seems like pretty lovable to me. I mean, I don't know if he's like polarizing with fans. I mean, there was that Kim Neely book that came out in the late 90s called 5 Against 1, which is an unauthorized biography of Pearl Jam. And none of the bands spoke to her for that book, but Dave did. And there's things in the book that are uncredited that seem like they probably came from him, that are really, because like one of the points of that book is it sort of undermines the mythology of Eddie Vedder. That seems like one of the sort of agendas of that book too, because again, that book came out at a time where there was skepticism of like how legit Eddie Vedder was. Is he really this angsty? Is this an act? And it seemed like that book, it was about sort of selling that narrative, which I think is, again, that's another thing that I think seems in retrospect to be a bit ill-advised. I mean, it's funny now because I think the media in general has a much more enlightened view of like mental health issues with famous people, particularly musicians. It's something that I think there's a lot more sensitivity about now than there was in the 90s. I think in the 90s with a person like Eddie Vedder, there was this common belief of like, just get over it, enjoy your fame, like why are you upset? Come on, like, this is ridiculous. Whereas I think now people would probably be a little more sensitive to the idea that like, yeah, it's obviously overwhelming for anyone to have that amount of scrutiny on you. And and this was also the period like where Eddie Vedder was having like problems with stalkers, people literally driving their cars at top speed into the wall in front of his house. Like, he had to build a wall for security reasons, and he was feeling at that time that he couldn't like even leave the house. I mean, that's obviously a traumatic thing for anyone to deal with. And again, it speaks to just how famous he was at that time, which again, I think if you were alive at that time, you remember it, but in retrospect, but future generations, I wonder if people realize that, like just how famous he was.
To relate, I guess, anybody who's been watching The Watcher on Netflix, imagine that's his everyday life. People are watching you all the time. You go out, you just got to go out and get a 6-pack of beer at the local store, and you got people staring at you. Oh, look, there he is.
Yeah.
I look back at that period, late 90s, early 2000s, as a Pearl Jam fan, and I think that's what it must have been like to be a Grateful Dead fan before A Touch of Grey, because I had friends that absolutely loved the band, as I did, and we'd get the albums, see them in concert. The attendances in concert were strong as ever, yet let's just say they're not talked about as much in MTV, radio plays their singles, but, for a month or so, then they're gone off the playlist. No Code 96, Yield 1998, early 2000s come along, Binaural 2000, Riot Act 2002. What comes to mind for you when you think about that period?
Well, I kind of think of that as like two different periods, because like like that late 90s versus like early 2000s, it seems like kind of different to me, because like late 90s, they were still, I think, just the 90s in general, I think, are just like a different period. Like that early 2000s period is interesting. I kind of dropped off with the band at that point, and like I remember seeing them on the Yield tour and thinking like, I think Pearl Jam might be done, like, not to say that they weren't great, but it's hard to articulate this, but like it'd only been 7 years since 10, but like it felt like a lot longer than that. And that had something to do with my age, I'm sure, being 14 versus being 21. But also just in the 90s, it was like two different decades, really, the late 90s versus the early 90s. And music had changed so much from what was going on in like 92 versus 98 that, Pearl Jam was so out of step, really, like with what was going on in the music world. And I think there was an assumption, certainly by me, and I feel like this was probably true of other people too, that Pearl Jam's just going to fade away now, because like, grunge is over and there's a new kind of music that is dominant now, and how's Pearl Jam going to survive this? So like that is what they're really trying to navigate once you get to the early 2000s, like with those early, like Binaural and Riot Act. And that's just like a weird time in America too, a weird time in American culture with 9/11. Then you have like the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the weird mood in the country at that time where there was like no resistance to going to war, really, like no real substantial resistance to it. And Pearl Jam was like among the people speaking out against that, and that was not a popular stand at all. So, but that was, I think, the beginning of them kind of figuring out like, what kind of band we're going to be in the future.
They got raw. The sound became stripped down. I felt like Binaural.
I love the songs on that album, and I think hearing the bootleg, that album in particular, I think really benefits from the live versions. Because really, I don't know if that record's more raw. It's like, in a way, that's like the most experimental period of their career. The production of that record, which I don't really like, but I respect what they were trying to do. It's a very murky sounding record.
That's the word.
And it's kind of, and I feel like the songs get lost a little bit in the production. And it's because the live versions are just more immediate, I think. And it sounds like the band. Those songs just come across so much better, like Insignificance, and Grievance, and Nothing As It Seems. And there's tons of good songs, I think, on Binaural.
Evacuation's great.
Yeah.
Where do you think the band's going from here?
I don't know. They've been around for a long time, and they seem like they're in a stable place. So from what I hear, they're working on a record right now, and I'll be curious to hear that. But yeah, they seem to be in a good place. There's no reason to me like why they wouldn't just continue on, but I guess we'll see what happens.
So the book is out now, Long Road Pearl Jam and the Soundtrack of a Generation through Hachette Books, right?
Yes.
Any website you want to let people know about or social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter for now anyway at Steven_Hyden.
All right, cool. Steven Hyden, thanks, man. This was great.
All right. Thanks for having me.
That's it. It's in the books.